I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Chris Melody Fields Figueredo, the Executive Director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, or BISC. Chris joins me to discuss how the ballot initiative process, a process by which citizens can propose, create, amend, or repeal state laws, is core to a strong democracy. Ballot initiatives, also known as ballot measures, can be used to shape everything from abortion access to a state's minimum wage requirements. It's a really powerful tool that citizens can use to shape laws in their own states. And like many powerful democratic processes these days, the ballot initiative process is under attack. Chris talks about the ways in which the process is at risk and who's behind those attacks. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Chris Melody Fields Figueredo. Chris Melody Fields Figueredo, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
During election cycles, everyone who covers those cycles, especially the big ones, they kind of focus on, in relation to the ballot, they focus on the candidates, which kind of makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I rarely hear a lot of coverage about the ballot initiatives, right? And in my state, in Washington state, there are always lots of initiatives on the ballot. But, it's a really big part of our democracy. So if you could just give me and the listeners kind of a ballot initiative 101, a primer, how do they get on the ballot? What are the requirements, etc.?
So about half the country has what we call the citizen-led initiative process. And if we take a further step back, one of the reasons why we have ballot measures or direct democracy is because over 120 years ago, our representatives in government were not listening to the people and not taking action on the issues that their communities were facing. There was a lot of something that sounds very similar to us today, a lot of influence with corporations and special interests. At that time, it was the railroad barons who had controlled the state legislatures. And so the initiative process was birthed out of giving the people the agency and power to take issues directly to their communities and in many ways pass policy that they were not seeing their representative in governments take. So about half the country has the citizen-led process, which means they go into their community, they gather signatures for a petition to get an issue on the ballot, anywhere from raising the minimum wage or codifying the right to an abortion in their state constitution. Now, I wish every single state had the same process. Some are indirect process in the sense that in the case of Michigan, they gather signatures. It can go before the state legislature. The state legislature can act and choose to pass the policy, or if they take no action, then it will go back to before voters. So it's a little different in many states, but what we generally know is the citizen-led process, which we gather signatures in our communities and put something before the ballot. The other half of the country, so I grew up in Texas. We do not have the citizen-led process in my home state. I didn't know anything about ballot measures until I left my home state. I mean, maybe there was something on the local level growing up, but I honestly don't remember. State legislatures have what is called the legislatively referred constitutional amendment process, where the state legislature can refer something to the ballot that then voters will take action on. So that's kind of the 101 process. I think what people are most familiar in states like California, Oregon, Washington State, or like Colorado, really a lot of the Western states, is this citizen-led process, which is what most people think about when we talk about direct democracy.
So in those states where they have kind of a process where the legislature refers something to the ballot, that would depend on, the political makeup of that legislature. So if you have a completely red legislature, so the things that are going to end up on the ballot
Absolutely.
as a ballot initiative are going to be conservative.
Yep.
Do I have that right?
Absolutely. And that's really a lot of what we're seeing even more and more these days, where we actually in 2022 saw less citizen led measures and overwhelmingly the majority of the ballot measures that were before voters in 2022 were referred mostly from conservative Republican led state legislatures. So many of those abortion bans that were on the ballot in 2022 were referred by state legislatures. So, what we often were, are trying to advocate for at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, and what we think is really important for direct democracy is to give citizens the power, right? We know what our community's needs are. We have these conversations with our communities. We can see if there's a housing crisis in our community. That is, was the original intent of the process, was it to be citizen driven. And what we are unfortunately seeing more and more is the state legislatures, primarily in conservative states, um, refer things to the ballot. And one of the reasons why that is happening is over the last several years, citizens have turned to the initiative process to make change, period. Raise the minimum wage, increase education funding for public education, to create a fair redistricting process. And after we started winning on those issues, state legislatures did not like that. They did not want to listen to the will of the people. And now, what we have been facing over the last several years is an attack on the ability for the people to take issues to the ballot.
Right, right. And I think, Mississippi, I think their Supreme Court, I don't know if this was recent, but they completely did away with their ballot initiative process. And I know that over the past few years, there have
Mhm.
been several attacks. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, yes, in 2021, the Mississippi State Supreme Court struck down the initiative process because the state essentially the language that when it was created, the process was created in Mississippi was now out of sync of how many congressional districts the state had because of redistricting in the census. So they had lost a congressional district, and the way the language was written into their constitution was you have to gather signatures from all of the five, I think at the time, congressional seats. All of those congressional seats don't exist. That's one way, and the courts are playing an increased role in the changes to the ballot measure process. But really, where we're seeing it is in state legislatures themselves, state legislators, doing anything from raising the threshold to pass a ballot measure. So I think most people understand, right? When you go and vote, whoever has 50 plus 1% of the vote in most cases, right? That's the winner.
Yeah.
Now they're trying to raise the threshold to 60%, to
Wow.
67%. I mean, it is so calculated in some states. For example, in Florida, after Amendment 4 passed in 2018, which was a ballot measure that restored voting rights to formerly incarcerated or returning citizens. After that measure passed overwhelmingly, 64% of the vote, the state legislature then introduced and then referred to the ballot a ballot measure that would increase the threshold to 65%. So these are being really calculated and very direct. Things like raising how many signatures you can gather and what does that, and who can gather signatures in a state. Right now before Missouri, you have to be a resident of the state. For college students, right? You may be going to college, you are in that state, and you may not be able to participate in this really important democratic process if the state legislature passes this. And ultimately, these are efforts to undermine the will of the people. Some politicians are not happy that citizens are taking power into their own hands and really trying to make change. Missouri has raised the minimum wage. They have legalized recreational marijuana. They have tried to change the redistricting process. They're hoping to, address issues like housing or, improving the voting process in the state. Some politicians are not happy with that, and so they're trying to change the rules to benefit themselves and not the people.
I'm presuming that most of these attacks are Republican led. I mean, just from what I've read.
I mean, they have been in GOP often trifecta states. Arizona is also one of those states that has been leading the charge. Again, as citizens have, they raised, well, in 2016 they raised the minimum wage and did some relief on paid sick. And then in 2018 they increased revenue for public education, and because of that, we've seen the state legislature, almost entirely try to wipe out the initiative process in the state. And these have all been started, or the attempts have been in GOP controlled states.
So you have ballot initiatives, and then you have, the ballot initiative process, which I think is really meta, is that sometimes
Mhm.
some ballot initiatives attack.
Yes, there are ballot measures
Right.
about ballot measures. Very, very meta.
So going back to the actual ballot initiatives, right, ballot measures, how many are you
Yes.
tracking,
Mhm.
for 2023 and 2024? Can you quantify that?
Yeah, so still there's a little bit, we don't know quite yet what 2024 will look like, but right now we are currently tracking 112 statewide measures for 2023. A couple have already qualified to the ballot so far. So for in Oklahoma, for example, there's state question 820, which would legalize marijuana for adults that are 21 years and older. They actually tried to get it to the ballot in 2022. There was a whole court case. It didn't happen. It was too late, and so now it's going to be before voters in 2023. We were able to defeat abortion bans or constitutionally guarantee the right to an abortion in several states in 2022. Some state legislatures are looking to refer measures that would further either all right ban or further restrict abortions in states. We're also looking at ballot measures, which has been actually a really key issue area over the last several years around democracy. Things like the power of governors to act in an emergency, things like voter ID. Again, many of these, what we'll see in 2023 will be more defensive measures, often things that will try to take rights away from folks, or create more onerous process. We're looking at potentially, depending what happens in these state legislatures, some more ballot measures that would restrict the process. So you'll see more municipal measures in an odd year. We see often less statewide measures in an odd year. Only actually a handful of states, like in Ohio and Maine, allow for statewide measures in an odd numbered year. So most of what we will see in 2023 are things that state legislatures are referring to the ballot.
Yeah, and for the listeners, if you go to ballot.org, on one of the links, you can see a breakdown of the ballot initiatives by category. And the top category, I think you've already said this, is democracy, right? Like democracy. Most of the
Yep.
measures are in relation to democracy, and I'm assuming those are attacks on democracy, not shoring
Mhm.
up democracy. I could be wrong.
I mean, the attacks on what we've been seeing across the states. I mean, I have a democracy background. I've worked in democracy and civil rights for the majority of my career. So what we've been seeing at the state level, right from restrictions to voting, what is happening on the initiative process is very much connected to that, right? What is happening across America is a power grab. The country is shifting. It's changing. We're in the middle of great generational change. We're in the middle of us as citizens really thinking about what our relationship with government and democracy looks like. And so, what we've been seeing over the last several years on the attacks on voting rights, the right to protest, that is deeply and directly connected to what is happening to the initiative process, where, we are seeing these power grabs across the country, and we're seeing a huge undermining of the will of the people. Democracy is ours. And unfortunately, there are those in government and our representatives in government who don't actually want a democracy formed by the people, that are actually very out of step and out of sync with what the people want. And so that's really what's at stake this year, next year, over the next, what this battle that we've sort of been in over the last couple years is, what is the future of American democracy, and is it going to be formed by the people?
Yeah, and that's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation because, it's gone way back, past the last several years if you think about it in terms of democracy broadly and voting rights, right? There has been a multi-pronged attack on democracy
Hmm.
for, the last, well, forever, but specifically over the last couple of decades. If you think about the gutting of the
Hmm.
Voting Rights Act, the Shelby v. Holder case,
Yep.
and this reminds me
Hmm.
so much of that in the ways that they're kind of attacking at, conservatives and Republicans and people who don't like democracy. They're just
Hmm.
attacking it from
Yeah.
every angle.
Absolutely. I mean, this is my life's work. Fun like side
Yeah.
story real quick. So I used to work at a civil rights organization. I was working on the Shelby v. Holder case at that job, and the future of the Voting Rights Act. I was called for jury duty the day that
Oh, no.
decision came down, and I'm like in between like the holding area for jurors and like going back into a conference call. And I like remember going to the judge. I was like, I cannot be on the. I believe in my civic duty, but I cannot do this because
Oh,
and
wow.
because there was this really important Supreme Court case, and he's like, yes, I understand, but your colleagues can do the work.
Oh, no.
He was like, I'm not having any of this right now.
Wow.
But yeah, it is. It's very much like this is what's happening in America.
Wait, so he didn't let you out
And
of
it's
jury
been
duty for that?
no, I didn't get. Essentially, I did not get selected. But he was like, that doesn't sound like an excuse to me.
Little do you know. But anyway, it's a very important thing. I
Yes.
mean, honestly,
Yeah.
we could have a whole conversation about Shelby v. Holder, which I talk about ad
Oh,
nauseum.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Going back to this conversation, I'm really glad we're having it because this is one that's underreported, the ballot initiatives. And I actually,
Yep.
before I talked to you, I did not know that there were risks to it to this extent,
Mhm.
right? Like I said, I live in a blue
Yeah.
state, Washington State, pretty safe. We have ballot measures, on every single
Mhm.
ballot initiatives. And I just kind of took that for granted. So I hope,
Yeah.
listeners are just like, realizing this is just one other area that we need to hyper focus on and make sure that we save, right?
Absolutely. It's going to be up to us. What is happening across the country in states like Arizona, Missouri, Florida, Colorado. Well, Colorado's being a little bit better, but states like Idaho, Oklahoma, right? Actually, some of those states are often forgotten, right? If we're thinking about elections in terms of the presidential or Congress or the Senate, right? States like in Idaho, Nebraska, Oklahoma are not often, reach the top of the conversation, but actually in states like that, the initiative process has been incredibly important, especially when they have conservatives control their state legislature to make real important progress and change. So this is something that everybody should be aware of. If it's not happening in your state, if it's not happening today, it may happen tomorrow. And this is so deeply connected to everything that is going on. And whether we as a country fall to fascism, I mean,
Exactly.
I got
Yeah.
to be blunt. Like this is what is at stake in America right now. Are we actually going to have a democracy?
Right. And I think we should not shy away from using the correct terms because if you look at what's happening as a
Mhm.
whole, the attacks on voting rights, the book bans and all the other bans, right?
Mhm.
And now this, yeah, it's very much at risk.
I mean, the book bans don't say gay. I mean,
Exactly.
literally, Florida right now is ground zero of what it will look like to have a police stakes sanctioned violence. Like what it would look like if we had fascism across the country. It is literally ground zero right now, and there are amazing advocates on the ground that are fighting back, that say this is not Florida, this is not. I mean, my parents live in Florida. Like these are their lives, and this is the lives of children and communities that are at stake, and we can't sleep on this. You can't say even in a Washington state that isn't going to happen here. Something what is happening in Florida can catch like wildflower. Oh, wildfire. Maybe wildflower too. I don't know.
Well, I would prefer wildflowers, you know?
For sure, right? But it is we the people. It's us that is going to have to stand in the face of fascism to stop it.
I think everyone should just take a step back and try, to think about
Mhm.
how you would describe what's happening here if you were seeing it happen in a different country, right?
Absolutely,
And just try to
100%.
look at it through that
Yep.
lens, right? I know that a lot of
Mhm.
people are worried
Mhm.
about being hyperbolic, but we really just have to be honest about what's happening here.
Sure, I'm Venezuelan American. I came to this country when I was 3 years old. My mother's Venezuelan, my dad's from the US. And what I am seeing happen in the United States is what happened to my home country. Um, and the reason my parents, decided to live and raise me in the United States was because of opportunity. And it was hard. I'm Latinx, we were working class. Certainly our democracy was not designed for me, um, and my family, but they believed in the promise and the hope. And they knew as a girl, someone who identifies as a woman, I would have more opportunity if I was raised in the United States. And my country, there is not opportunity. In Venezuela, there's not an opportunity for young people. My cousins have left
Yeah.
because there aren't jobs. That is what is possible in the United States if we just close our eyes and say, not here. Actually, it is happening here. And I don't want to scare folks, because I do believe we can stop it. I think we do have the agency to stop it, but we can't sit back and say, well, that'll never happen here. It's happening here.
Yeah. That's what I think is so beautiful about your work on this specific project, given what you just told me about your family's background. And there's nothing more core to democracy than citizens shaping the legislation and the country that they live in. There's
Mhm.
nothing,
Mhm.
that's more central to the core of the country and democracy than that. And
Mhm.
that's why I think it's so beautiful that you're actually working on this specific project.
No, I mean, that's what excites me, right? What excites me about ballot measures is possibility. And we believe very strongly at BISC that it needs to be a citizen grassroots led effort. The people who are most impacted by whatever change we seek. So, if we're thinking about housing, right, we need to be talking to the communities that do not have homes or are at risk of high rent or cannot find affordable housing. They are the ones that we need to be talking to before we even think about drafting any policy. We have to center them. And these are often going to be low income communities of color that are not often included or given a seat at the table when we create any policy in the United States, right? Like that, we believe so strongly that it has to be not just a citizen led effort, that it actually has to be led by the very people impacted by the change we seek. Florida Amendment 4 was led by returning citizens, formerly incarcerated folks. Who better to know the impact of losing the right to vote than someone who was incarcerated and lost that right? That's what we're trying to do here. And what does it mean when we center equity and justice? When we from the idea to the campaign and all the way through we talk about the 360 life cycle, like we have to think about every phase of the work and how we are censoring people, equity, and justice to ensure that we actually have policy and process that reflects people. Like that's what that I think that is to me, the excitement about the possibility of ballot measures is it gives us agency, unlike many of the other tools we have in our democracy.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. You're right. You said the promise of this country and
Mhm,
this vision. And we're all kind of working towards that promise. We have. I don't think anyone
mhm,
that I've talked to, especially activists and organizers, have ever said that this is a perfect place. That's why they're doing what they're doing, and we're all
mhm,
kind of working towards that
mhm.
promise. And this, like I said, this ballot initiative process is closest to the core of democracy than anything I've heard of. And so
Yep,
I'm presuming,
I think
given
that's
what
right.
you've said, that there's also a demographic shake out to how ballot initiatives are filed, right? Do you have any data on
Mhm,
that?
mhm. Yeah, so I mean, I think this is one of the challenges that we're seeing with these restrictions that we're seeing to the ballot initiative process, right? When you increase the signature thresholds, when you increase the threshold to pass, you're actually making it now a process with for people with moneyed interests. It is harder for a grassroots organization from, you know, I'm trying to think of a small town in Washington State. It makes it so much harder, for community centered or grassroots organizations to actually be able to engage in a citizen led process if you are increasing restrictions, or raising thresholds that allow them to engage. So, we think it is so critically important that a process that was created to push back on special interest money, if we make it almost impossible, right, for everyday people to engage in ballot measures, then it actually isn't a people centered effort anymore. It's going to be Uber and Lyft. By the way, they have in California have tried put ballot measures on the
Yeah.
process. Then it doesn't that
Well,
this is what we face is the corporatization of ballot
yeah.
measures. And that was not that's
Yeah.
the antithesis of why they were
Yeah.
created.
Yeah. So if you are a listener and a citizen and this conversation has really concerned you, or maybe it's kind of inspired you, what's your
Mhm,
call to action to people, and as far as like saving the ballot initiative process, getting ballots, ballot initiatives in their state?
mhm,
I know you offer training and there's lots of information there on
mhm.
ballot.org. What's your advice?
I mean, I think 2022 was an example of we have to stop listening to polls and pundits. There was a narrative written about 2022 way back at the beginning of the year that it was going to be a red wave, right? And so every decision that was made after that was based on that narrative. There's a different story of what happened in 2022. We won every single abortion ballot measure. We raised the minimum wage in several states. We abolished slavery in several states. So we won in so many incredibly important ways. And so that means it's on us if that's the world we want to live in, right? If this is the change we seek, then it requires us to stand up and fight back, to go into our state legislatures, in the states where they're trying to roll back and not implement these measures that we pass as citizens, to try to take away the citizen led process. You got to stand up. You got to speak out. You have the ability to go to great grassroots organizations in your states, learn more about the work that they're trying to do, and get in and become a part of the way they're thinking about building power in their state, and potentially work with them to bring an issue before the ballot, things like paid leave. So it really requires us, the call to action is to get involved. Certainly you can go to ballot.org, learn more about the work that we do at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, but I guarantee there's a local organization where you are right now that is radically reimagining what is possible, and you can be a part of those dreams and imaginations. So, you know, get on Google, search, or go into your community, because there are so many phenomenal. Our role at BISC is to support leaders and organizations on the ground, right? And I can tell you, they're just badass, friggin' awesome groups in your local communities that are already fighting back. So I encourage you to get involved.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me. This has been really instructive. You've enlightened me, about this process, and I feel really kind of inspired and armed with information. I'm a little worried still, but I am I'm more inspired.
Sure, you got it. Work anxiety can be a motivating factor
That's
too.
true. That's true.